This 1918 factory portrait looks clean until you notice the girl's scarf. This 1918 factory portrait looks clean until you notice the girl's scarf. At first glance, it seemed like patriotic propaganda, the kind of image munitions plants circulated to prove that war work was dignified and safe. A young woman in a pressed blouse, standing beside a gleaming shell casing machine, her chin lifted with something like pride. But one detail refused to behave. A single discolored mark on the fabric around her neck would eventually crack open a story of industrial secrecy, chemical poisoning, and dozens of deaths that were never supposed to leave the factory floor. Dr. Miriam Okonkwo has spent 14 years as a curator of industrial history at a small university archive in northern New Jersey. Her specialty is occupational photography, the formal portraits commissioned by factories and railroads during the first half of the 20th century. Most of these images follow a predictable formula: clean uniforms, orderly workstations, employees arranged to suggest efficiency and contentment. The photographs were designed for shareholders, government inspectors, and recruitment brochures. They were not designed to tell the truth. The image that changed everything arrived in a banker's box from a demolished estate in Montclair. The house had belonged to a man named Theodore Burgess, whose family had once held a minority stake in a munitions complex in Newark. When Burgess died without heirs in 2019, his effects passed through probate and eventually landed with a local historical society that lacked the resources to process them. The society contacted Miriam's archive, offering the contents of 3 boxes in exchange for a tax receipt. Miriam opened the first box expecting ledgers and stock certificates. Instead, she found photographs, dozens of them. Factory interiors, posed group shots, equipment demonstrations. Most were unremarkable. But one print, mounted on heavy cardstock and bearing the studio stamp of a Newark commercial photographer, stopped her cold. The image showed a young woman, perhaps 18 or 19, standing in 3/4 profile beside a lathe used to shape artillery shells. Her hair was pinned beneath a cloth cap, and she wore a dark cotton blouse with a high collar. Around her neck, loosely knotted, was a light-colored scarf, the kind of accessory that might have been added to feminize an otherwise industrial scene. Her mouth curved into a careful smile, and her hands rested on the machine's polished surface. Everything about the composition said, "This work is respectable." Miriam scanned the print at high resolution, as she did with all acquisitions. It was during that scan, zooming in to examine the fabric grain, that she noticed the scarf more closely. The material was not uniformly colored. Near the lower edge, where it would have rested against the woman's collarbone, there were several irregular patches of discoloration. They looked at first like water stains or age damage. But the pattern was wrong. The marks were concentrated in a band across the center of the fabric, fading toward the edges, as if something had seeped outward from a central point. Miriam had seen stains like this before, not on clothing, but on laboratory samples and archival documents from chemical plants. The discoloration followed a pattern consistent with burn damage from acidic compounds, the kind of compounds used in explosives manufacturing. She looked again at the woman's face, searching for any sign of discomfort. The smile held, but now it seemed practiced, perhaps even forced. This was not just a factory portrait. Something here was wrong. Miriam Okonkwo did not set out to become an expert in industrial photography. She trained as an art historian with a dissertation on documentary portraiture in Depression-era America. But academic jobs in her field were scarce, and when the position at the New Jersey Archive opened in 2008, she took it. The work was quieter than she had imagined. Most days involved processing donations, answering genealogical inquiries, and digitizing fragile prints. She rarely encountered anything that required genuine investigation. Over 14 years, she had cataloged thousands of images: factory interiors, mine shafts, railroad depots, textile mills. She knew the visual grammar of industrial portraiture as well as anyone in her field. She knew how light was used to mask unsafe conditions, how angles were chosen to exclude evidence of child labor, how staging transformed hazardous work into something resembling pride. Most of the deceptions were subtle: a floor swept clean for the camera, a supervisor positioned to block a broken guardrail, a worker's hands posed to hide an injury. The photograph of the young munitions worker was different. The staging was competent, even elegant. But the scarf did not belong. It disrupted the composition, drawing the eye away from the woman's face and toward her neck. Factory portraits rarely included accessories that served no practical purpose. Scarves could catch in machinery. They were liabilities, not decorations. Someone had wanted this scarf in the photograph, or someone had needed it there. Miriam removed the print from its mount and examined the reverse. A faded pencil inscription read, E. Kowalczyk, Shell Dept, March 1918. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had written a number, 47. There was no indication of what the number meant. A worker identification code, perhaps, or something else entirely. She returned to the scan and magnified the scarf again. The burn marks were unmistakable now. They formed a rough crescent across the lower portion of the fabric, consistent with exposure to a corrosive liquid that had dripped or splashed from above. If the scarf had been wrapped around the woman's neck at the time of exposure, the burns would have followed the curve of her throat. Miriam felt a familiar unease, the sensation she experienced whenever an image revealed more than its makers intended. If she catalogued this photograph and moved on, no one would ever know what the scarf concealed. But if she pursued the question, she might uncover a story that had been deliberately buried for over a century. She thought about the woman's smile, the careful tilt of her chin, the way her hands rested so precisely on the machine. Someone had posed her to project confidence. But confidence in what? The studio stamp on the photograph led Miriam to the records of a commercial photography firm that had operated in Newark between 1904 and 1921. The firm specialized in industrial commissions, producing images for annual reports, safety manuals, and promotional materials. Its client list included several munitions manufacturers that had expanded rapidly during the First World War. One name appeared repeatedly in the surviving ledgers, the Consolidated Ordnance Corporation, a shell-making operation headquartered on Frelinghuysen Avenue. Consolidated Ordnance had been founded in 1915 by a group of investors who recognized that the war in Europe would eventually draw in the United States. By 1917, the company employed nearly 2,000 workers across 3 facilities, producing artillery shells, detonators, and TNT-based explosives. The workforce was overwhelmingly female. Men were needed for combat, and munitions work was classified as essential war production. Women filled the gap, recruited from immigrant communities and working-class neighborhoods across northern New Jersey. Miriam contacted Dr. Samuel Reyes, a historian at Rutgers who had written extensively on labor conditions in wartime industries. He confirmed what she suspected. Munitions factories during the First World War were among the most dangerous workplaces in America. The primary hazard was TNT, a powerful explosive that was also a potent toxin. Workers who handled TNT or worked in areas where it was processed absorbed the chemical through their skin, inhaled its dust, and ingested it through contaminated food. The symptoms began gradually: headaches, nausea, skin irritation. But prolonged exposure led to far worse: liver damage, anemia, jaundice so severe that it turned the skin bright yellow. The workers had a name for it. They called themselves Canary Girls. Dr. Reyes had documented cases of TNT poisoning at factories across the Northeast, but Consolidated Ordnance did not appear in his research. "That's not surprising," he told Miriam. "The companies that left the clearest records were the ones that faced public scrutiny, usually because of strikes or lawsuits. The ones that managed to keep their problems internal left almost nothing behind." Miriam turned to the New Jersey State Archives, searching for inspection reports, incident logs, and worker compensation claims filed during the war years. What she found was sparse but suggestive. Consolidated Ordnance had received 6 visits from state labor inspectors between 1916 and 1918. Each visit had resulted in a favorable report noting adequate ventilation, proper safety equipment, and satisfactory working conditions. But the reports were almost identical in wording, as if they had been copied from a template. One inspector's name appeared on all 6 documents: Albert J. Harrigan. A separate search revealed that Albert Harrigan had left the state labor department in 1920 to take a position as plant manager at a rubber factory in Trenton. The rubber factory was owned by the same investment group that had founded Consolidated Ordnance. The connection was not proof of corruption, but it suggested that the official record could not be trusted. Miriam returned to the Burgess papers, hoping to find private correspondence or internal memoranda that might contradict the sanitized inspection reports. Near the bottom of the second box, beneath a bundle of canceled checks, she discovered a leather-bound notebook. The cover was unmarked, but inside, in careful cursive, someone had recorded a series of entries dated between January and November 1918. Each entry consisted of a name, a date, a brief description, and a number. The descriptions included phrases like respiratory collapse, liver failure, acute anemia, and cause withheld. The numbers ranged from 1 to 63. Entry number 47 read, E. Kowalczyk, March 22, 1918, skin lesions, jaundice, respiratory distress, removed from shell department, status pending. The handwriting matched the inscription on the back of the photograph. The leather notebook was not a medical record in any formal sense. It contained no diagnoses, no treatment notes, no physician signatures. It was something closer to an inventory, a private tally kept by someone inside Consolidated Ordnance who wanted to document what the company was hiding from regulators. The 63 entries represented 63 workers who had shown symptoms consistent with TNT poisoning between January and November 1918. Some had been transferred to other departments, some had been sent home with vague assurances that their conditions were temporary. At least 14 had died. Miriam brought the notebook to Dr. Reyes, who examined it alongside the photograph in the Burgess estate papers. His initial assessment was grim. "This is a cover-up log," he said. "Whoever kept this was tracking the company's exposure, not the workers' health. Every entry is evidence of a liability they were trying to contain." The timing of the entries was significant. In early 1918, the United States government had begun to take a closer interest in labor conditions at munitions plants. A series of accidents at facilities in Pennsylvania and Ohio had drawn public attention to the dangers of explosives manufacturing. There were calls for stricter regulation, independent inspections, and compensation for injured workers. The War Department, anxious to maintain production levels, resisted most of these measures, but it did issue informal guidance encouraging companies to address the most visible hazards. TNT poisoning was one of them. Consolidated Ordnance's response, according to Dr. Reyes, was typical of the industry. Rather than invest in ventilation systems, protective equipment, or reduced exposure times, the company focused on concealment. Workers who developed symptoms were removed from the production floor before inspectors arrived. Those with visible jaundice were given time off until their skin color returned to normal. Deaths were attributed to influenza, pneumonia, or heart failure, conditions that would not trigger federal scrutiny. The notebook suggested that this strategy had worked. Not a single case of TNT poisoning had been officially reported at Consolidated Ordnance during the entire war. Dr. Reyes introduced Miriam to a colleague in the chemistry department, Dr. Helen Matsuda, who specialized in historical toxicology. Dr. Matsuda examined the high-resolution scans of the photograph and confirmed what Miriam had suspected. The marks on the scarf were consistent with burns caused by picric acid, a TNT derivative used in detonator assemblies. Picric acid was highly corrosive and turned skin and fabric a distinctive yellowish-brown when it oxidized. The pattern of the burns suggested that the woman had been splashed with the acid while working at close range to a filling station or mixing tank. The scarf was almost certainly concealing a chemical burn, Dr. Matsuda said. The injury would have been on her neck or upper chest. In March 1918, when this photograph was taken, she would have been in the early stages of systemic poisoning. The jaundice would come later, but the burns would have been visible immediately. The photograph, in other words, was not a celebration of war work. It was a piece of damage control. Someone at Consolidated Ordnance had commissioned a portrait of an injured worker, posed to disguise her injuries, and distributed it as evidence that conditions at the plant were safe. The woman's smile was not pride. It was performance. Miriam spent the following weeks tracing the fate of the 63 workers listed in the notebook. The task was difficult. Many of the names were common among the Polish, Italian, and Irish immigrant communities that had supplied most of Consolidated Ordnance's labor force. Birth and death records from the era were incomplete, and several of the women had married and changed their names in the years after the war. But by cross-referencing census data, parish registers, and cemetery records, Miriam was able to identify 31 of the workers with reasonable confidence. Of those 31, 19 had died before 1925. The average age at death was 26. The causes listed on death certificates included anemia, liver disease, heart failure, and pneumonia. Not one certificate mentioned TNT poisoning or chemical exposure. The official record told a story of ordinary illness. Striking young women in the prime of their lives, the notebook told a different story entirely. Entry number 47, E. Kowalczyk, was among the dead. A death certificate filed in Newark in September 1918 identified her as Elżbieta Kowalczyk, age 19, cause of death listed as acute anemia. She was buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in North Arlington in a plot purchased by her parents. The cemetery records noted that she had been employed as a factory worker at the time of her death. No employer was named. Miriam presented her findings to the Archives Advisory Board in November 2022. The board consisted of university administrators, local historians, and a representative from the New Jersey Historical Commission. She brought copies of the photograph, the notebook, the inspection reports, and her research into the fates of the workers. She proposed a small exhibition focused on the photograph and its context that would tell the story of Consolidated Ordnance and the women who had been poisoned and erased from the historical record. The response was not what she expected. The board members listened politely, examined the materials, and asked careful questions. But when the discussion turned to the proposed exhibition, the tone shifted. One administrator raised concerns about the sourcing. "The notebook is compelling," she said, "but it's essentially an anonymous document. We don't know who wrote it or why. It could be a disgruntled employee exaggerating to settle a score." Another member worried about the political implications. Munitions workers are a sensitive topic right now. There's a lot of debate about industrial policy, labor rights, corporate responsibility. If we present this as a case of deliberate harm and cover-up, we'll be accused of taking sides. The representative from the Historical Commission was more direct. The Burgess family still has connections in this area. Not political connections necessarily, but philanthropic ones. Several of their descendants have donated to local museums and preservation efforts. If we build an exhibition that portrays their ancestors' company as a death factory, there will be consequences. Miriam listened to these objections and felt something harden inside her. She had anticipated resistance, but not this kind. The board was not disputing her evidence. They were not claiming that the women had not been poisoned or that the company had not concealed their deaths. They were simply asking her to consider whether telling the truth was worth the trouble it might cause. "These were real people," she said. "Elżbieta Kowalczyk was a real person. She was 19 years old when she died. Her death certificate says anemia, but we know that's not what killed her. We have the photograph, we have the notebook, we have the pattern of early deaths across dozens of workers. If we don't tell their story, who will?" The board voted to delay the exhibition pending further review. The decision was framed as procedural, a matter of ensuring academic rigor before public presentation. But Miriam understood what it meant. The archive would sit on the materials indefinitely, citing a need for additional research until the moment passed and everyone moved on to other things. She began reaching out to journalists and independent historians. A reporter at a regional newspaper expressed interest, but was reassigned to another beat before the story could be published. A documentary filmmaker asked for access to the materials, but lost funding when his production company decided the subject was too niche. Months passed. The photograph remained in the archive's climate-controlled storage, unseen by anyone outside the university. In the spring of 2023, Miriam received an unexpected email. It came from a woman named Catherine Novak, who identified herself as the great-granddaughter of one of the workers listed in the notebook. Catherine had been researching her family history and had stumbled across a reference to Miriam's work in an academic database. She wanted to know if the archive held any materials related to her ancestor, a woman named Anna Nowak who had worked at a munitions plant in Newark during the First World War. Miriam checked the notebook. Entry number 23. A. Nowak, February 8, 1918. Jaundice, tremors, nausea. Transferred to packing department. Status uncertain. Anna Nowak had survived, according to the census records, but had died in 1931 at the age of 34. The cause of death was listed as liver failure. Catherine's email changed everything. She was not alone. She had been in contact with other descendants, a loose network of families who had inherited fragments of memory about mothers and grandmothers who had worked in the factories and come home sick. None of them had known about consolidated ordnance specifically, but they had all grown up with stories of young women who had aged before their time, whose skin had turned strange colors, who had coughed and shook and wasted away. The families had assumed it was bad luck or weak constitutions. They had never imagined it was something that had been done to them. The descendants organized. Catherine Nowak became the informal coordinator, connecting families across New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York whose ancestors had worked in munitions plants during the war. They pooled their resources, hired a genealogist, and began building a database of workers, matching names to death records, cemetery plots, and surviving photographs. Within 6 months, they had identified over 200 women who had worked at Consolidated Ordnance between 1916 and 1918. At least 40 of them had died before the age of 35. The group contacted the New Jersey Department of Labor, requesting that the state acknowledge the historical failure of its inspection system and issue a formal statement recognizing the workers who had been harmed. The request worked its way through bureaucratic channels for months before landing on the desk of a sympathetic official who agreed to review the materials. In December 2023, the department issued a brief statement acknowledging that labor conditions at certain wartime industrial facilities may not have been adequately monitored and expressing regret for any harm that may have resulted. It was not an apology, but it was a start. Miriam, meanwhile, had found a different path forward. She submitted an article to a journal of labor history, documenting the Consolidated Ordnance cover-up and analyzing the photograph of Elżbieta Kowalczyk in detail. The article was accepted and published in early 2024. It drew attention from historians, journalists, and activists who had been working on related issues. A podcaster who covered industrial disasters devoted 2 episodes to the story. A local television station produced a short documentary. The photograph of Elżbieta, with its hidden burn marks and its manufactured smile, began to circulate online. The Archives Advisory Board reconvened in March 2024. The political calculus had shifted. The story was now public, and the archive risked appearing complicit in suppression if it continued to sit on the materials. The board voted to proceed with the exhibition with one condition. The display would include a statement acknowledging the limitations of the historical record and the ongoing scholarly debate about the interpretation of the evidence. The exhibition opened in September 2024, 106 years after Elżbieta Kowalczyk posed for her portrait. The centerpiece was the photograph itself, displayed at large scale with annotations highlighting the burn marks on the scarf. Beside it hung a reproduction of her death certificate, with the words acute anemia circled in red. A panel explained what those words concealed. The descendants were invited to the opening. Catherine Nowak gave a short speech, standing before the photograph of a woman she had never met, but whose fate was intertwined with her grandmother's. These women went to work because they believed they were serving their country, she said. They were told that the work was safe, that the company cared about them, that they were part of something important. And when they got sick, when they started dying, the company covered it up. They erased these women from history. We are here to write them back in. In the weeks that followed, visitors left notes in a comment book near the exit. Many of them were from people who had never heard of the Canary Girls, who had not known that women could be poisoned by the explosives they helped to make. Several were from descendants of munitions workers at other factories who recognized in Elżbieta's story echoes of their own family histories. One note, written in a trembling hand, read simply, "My grandmother worked in a shell factory in Pennsylvania. She died when I was 5. I always wondered why." The photograph of Elżbieta Kowalczyk was never meant to survive. It was a piece of corporate propaganda designed to project an image of safety and normalcy that bore no relationship to the reality of the factory floor. The photographer who took it, the manager who commissioned it, the inspector who signed off on the sanitized reports, all of them assumed that their careful staging would hold. They did not anticipate that a single detail, a scarf with burn marks hidden in plain sight, would eventually betray them. Old photographs are not neutral. They are constructed, posed, and curated to serve the interests of the people who commission them. The subjects rarely have control over how they are represented. A worker told to smile for the camera smiles. A uniform is adjusted to hide a bandage. A scarf is draped to conceal a wound. The image that results looks like a document, a frozen moment of truth. But it is also a lie. And sometimes the lie is the only thing that remains visible. There are other photographs like this one. In archives and attics and estate sales across the country, images survive that contain evidence their makers never intended to preserve. A group portrait from a textile mill where every worker's hands are positioned to hide missing fingers. A family photograph from a plantation where an enslaved child stands in the background, her posture rigid, her face blank. A publicity shot from a mining company where the dust in the air tells a different story than the smiling faces in the foreground. These images require us to look twice. They require us to notice what has been staged and to ask what the staging conceals. They require us to remember that for every portrait that survives, there were people behind the frame whose stories were never recorded, whose injuries were never acknowledged, whose deaths were attributed to ordinary causes and filed away. Elżbieta Kowalczyk was 19 years old when she posed for her portrait. She was sick, possibly already dying, from chemicals that her employer knew were dangerous. The company dressed her up, arranged her hands on a machine, draped a scarf over her wounds, and asked her to smile. She did what she was told. She had no choice. But the photograph preserved something the company did not intend, evidence of its own cruelty, hidden in the texture of a burned scarf, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. The camera recorded what the company wanted, but it also recorded what the company tried to hide. And sometimes, a century later, those hidden details are all that remain to tell us what really happened.